Today we're pleased to have a presentation by Jamie Corroon. This slide is just a reminder to please be sure to follow us on social media. And we do have CME credits. If you go ahead and text to 14238, you will get CME credits. You need to register, I believe, with UCSD, and I think Carla shares that on occasion. Also, just a reminder, this meeting is being recorded. Jamie is a project scientist here with the CMCR. He's also a licensed neuropathic doctor. He recently completed his 2-year postdoctoral fellowship in the Department of Family Medicine, where he investigated the impact of cannabis use on cardiovascular health. And that work was funded by a T32 training grant from the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. We're very pleased to have Jamie presenting to us on some of his recent publications. So Dr. Corroon, it is all yours.
Okay, thank you, Tom. I'm actually a naturopathic doctor, but maybe that's just as obscure as a neuropathic doctor.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Okay.
As Tom mentioned, I just completed a 2-year postdoc in the Department of Family Medicine, where I focused on the impact of regular cannabis use on various cardiovascular outcomes. This presentation will mostly focus on blood pressure and hypertension, but I'm going to try to include some findings from some of our other studies that utilized different cardiovascular outcomes. In order to do that, I'll have to sacrifice some depth in order for breadth, and I'll have to ask you to hold your questions till the end unless it's something quick, and I apologize in advance for that. My primary mentor during that program was Dr. Matt Allison in the Department of Family Medicine, Dr. Grant, and whom you all know, and Dr. Bradley in the Department of Public Health, or the School of Public Health, were secondary mentors. I should mention I'm on the board of directors of a company called CV Sciences, which manufactures a variety of different natural products, including a line of hemp-derived CBD products. We're going to start out by talking about the endocannabinoid system and its role in cardiovascular function. I will discriminate between both direct and indirect effects. Then we'll talk a little bit about some of the limitations of existing cardiovascular disease epidemiology as it relates to cannabis use. Then we'll look at some data from 3 different data sets, NHANES, MESA, and CARDIA, and then wrap up with some conclusions. So cannabinoids exert complex effects on the cardiovascular system through both direct and indirect pathways, both of which are mediated by cannabinoid receptors. And there are non-cannabinoid receptors involved, like GPR55, for example, but the focus of this presentation will be on CB1 and CB2. The direct effects are mediated by cannabinoid receptors located in the heart and vascular tissue themselves. And the indirect effects are mediated by cannabinoid receptors on neurons within the autonomic nervous system and white blood cells and immune tissues in the immune system, the latter of which, CB2, are upregulated during disease states. So the direct effects are primarily CB1 receptor effects, and they've been studied in vitro and other mechanistic preclinical studies using natural and synthetic cannabinoids as ligands. Generally speaking, and this is an oversimplification, activation of CB1 receptors on these cells produces effects associated with cardiovascular pathology, including oxidative stress, inflammation, and fibrosis. CB1 receptors have been identified on fibroblasts, which are the cells responsible for producing structural proteins like collagen and aid in tissue repair. They've been identified on endothelial cells, which are particularly important, as we'll talk about. And here, these endothelial cells line the blood vessels and are in contact with the blood. They regulate vascular tone. Cardiac myocytes are the cardiac muscle cells that are responsible for contraction of the heart. And then vascular smooth muscle cells as well. There's as you probably know, a layer of smooth muscle in arteries. Here's a little more detail on these direct effects. I'm just going to focus on vascular endothelial cells.
Excuse me, Tom, are you able to? Okay, she's muted. Fine, thank you. There was
Thanks,
just
Dr. Grant.
interference there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, in the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on vascular endothelial cells. They are probably the most important cell type because endothelial injury or endothelial dysfunction is really the critical first step in most cardiovascular and cerebrovascular disease. And high blood pressure can cause endothelial dysfunction. The shear stress or the mechanical stress of blood under high pressure against the endothelium can cause injury. And then endothelial dysfunction can also cause high blood pressure and hypertension. And as I mentioned, it's typically the first step in the development of atherosclerosis. And so activation of CB1 receptors on vascular endothelial cells has mixed effects. On one hand, it promotes nitric oxide release, which is theoretically good in that it leads to vasodilation and lowering of blood pressure. On the other hand, it increases oxidative stress. It activates inflammatory pathways, including enhancing or increasing the expression of cellular adhesion molecules. Indirect effects are also mediated by cannabinoid receptors, but on neurons of the autonomic nervous system and on white blood cells. As I mentioned, the role of the CB1 receptor in this setting is one of neuroregulation, while the role of the CB2 receptor, which we'll see in a moment, is consistent with immunoregulation. And the indirect effects are particularly complex because they involve both sympathetic and parasympathetic effects. So here on the left, you can see autonomic nerves coming from the central nervous system to the heart. This blue line is a parasympathetic nerve. This is the vagus nerve, which uses acetylcholine, which lowers heart rate and cardiac contractility. These green lines are sympathetic nerves going to the heart and the adrenal medulla, which use norepinephrine and epinephrine respectively, which increases heart rate and cardiac contractility. On the right here, we have this retrograde signaling that is characteristic of the endocannabinoid system, and both excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmission is suppressed through this mechanism called depolarization-induced suppression. So the postsynaptic neuron here is depolarized during neurotransmission. Endocannabinoid enzymes are activated. They cleave an arachidonic acid off the cell membrane. It's converted to anandamide or 2-AG, which diffuses in a retrograde direction. It activates CB1 on the presynaptic neuron, which inhibits calcium channels and results in an endocytosis or retraction of these vesicles, thus suppressing neurotransmission. And that is happening here in the sympathetic ganglia for excitatory neurotransmission, and then in the spinal cord and the brain for both sympathetic and or excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmission. So tachycardia or increased heart rate is one of the more common adverse effects of cannabis use. And this might seem like the result of a surge of catecholamines triggered during a fight or flight response, but somewhat counterintuitively, it's more the result of greater inhibition of inhibitory neurotransmission than it is some sort of stimulation of excitatory neurotransmission. And that's what the different font size is intended to convey here. And effectively what happens is that it creates this autonomic imbalance that shifts towards a sympathetic state, which leads to increased heart rate, increased cardiac contractility, and variable effects on cardiac output and blood pressure. If cardiac output is increased, typically blood pressure is increased. If cardiac output is decreased, then typically blood pressure is decreased. And so hyper or hypotension, typically transient, are both potential outcomes with acute cannabis use. The CB2 receptor story is one of immune regulation. As I mentioned, CB2 receptors are upregulated during the immune response, during inflammation. Here on the right, we're looking at a cross-section of an artery. Here's the lumen where the blood flows. This thin layer right here is called the endothelium, which is that layer of vascular endothelial cells. This is the subendothelial space, and here's that smooth muscle layer. The blue receptor is a CB1 receptor, the light blue, the lighter blue. The darker one is a CB2 receptor. And here is anandamide in green and 2-AG in blue. endocannabinoids are synthesized on demand in response to cellular stress. And so this is endothelial injury, and so there is cellular stress. I mentioned that activation of CB1 on vascular endothelial cells produces nitric oxide, which diffuses here to cause vasodilation by interacting with smooth muscle cells. And I'll mention what happens with CB2 receptors in a moment. But as part of this inflammatory process, there's an increased expression of cellular adhesion molecules. So monocytes that are floating by in the blood will attach. Given the increased permeability here in the endothelium, they'll slip through and enter the endothelial space, the subendothelial space. In response to cytokines and chemokines, these monocytes are converted to macrophages. LDL particles also are able to slip through now. They're oxidized. Macrophages engulf the oxidized LDL to become foam cells. During this process, fibroblasts are being recruited into this space, as are smooth muscles. And essentially what atherosclerotic plaques are composed of are foam cells and fibroblasts and smooth muscle cells. And both AEA and 2AG have been identified in plaques. The takeaway point here is that there's a CB2 receptor on this neutrophil, a CB2 receptor on this T cell, and a CB2 receptor on this macrophage. And activation of CB2 reduces the production and secretion of inflammatory mediators. And so in the same way with CB1 in the nervous system, we talked about a suppression of neurotransmission. Here we're talking about a suppression of inflammation or inflammatory mediators. And obviously, I'm oversimplifying. So to summarize, there are both direct and indirect effects mediated by cannabinoid receptors. And theoretically, there's this dynamic balance that occurs between the harmful effects that are mediated by CB1 and the protective effects that are mediated by CB2. And this balance somehow determines the long-term consequences of cannabis use, or at least contributes to it. And then we have the influence of smoke itself, which is full of particulate matter and the other byproducts of combustion. And smoke acts as a mechanical and chemical irritant to the respiratory epithelium, which induces a sympathetic dominant response as well, which leads to a variety of these same types of effects. And to be clear, this is smoke that is devoid of nicotine and devoid of cannabinoids. So it's just smoke itself. And it also has this added feature that it contains carbon monoxide, which binds more strongly to hemoglobin than oxygen does. And so smoking, or smoking cannabis in this case, reduces the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. And so you can imagine a scenario where an individual has advanced cardiovascular disease, there's a lack of perfusion to their heart, they smoke cannabis, there's greater myocardial strain because the heart is beating faster, it's beating harder due to this sympathetic dominant response, and there's less oxygen available in the blood. And as a result, that individual may be at risk for an acute cardiovascular acute ischemic event. Chronic effects are really just the result of compounded acute responses over time, as opposed to any new distinct mechanism. And regular use does lead to tolerance, but typically these cardiac effects are not eliminated with repetitive use. They're just attenuated. The magnitude of the effect is somewhat attenuated. Okay, so moving on to cannabis use in cardiovascular disease epidemiology. There are several important limitations to point out in this field. First is there's uncertainty related to measuring cannabis use as an exposure. Observational studies use self-report, which you know, which is prone to recall bias and social desirability bias, and other factors that may lead to misclassification. Furthermore, many of the questionnaires that are used neglect to accurately quantify the exposure by failing to measure, say, the amount of cannabis that is used, or to differentiate between various methods of use, or to account for the various ingredients in the products. And as we know today in these dispensaries, there are some fairly complex products that people are using, and none of that information is captured in these studies. Secondly, these are not randomized, and as a result, confounding factors pose a real challenge. Many factors are not accurate measures of what they purport to measure, like maybe alcohol or illicit drug use. And as a result, there may be residual confounding, even though these variables are included in multivariable models. Other factors like sleep or like meditation are not measured at all. And as a result, they're not even included in the models. And as a result, there's a degree of unmeasured confounding that may influence the results. And third, most of the research out there is cross-sectional and, excuse me, and a meaningful percentage of those cross-sectional studies look at ever users versus never users, for example, which I don't think is that helpful. Many of them look at past month use, which is referred to often as current use, which I think is a misnomer. We refer to past month use as recent use. I think that current use language came from tobacco research, where the questions literally are you a current smoker, or how many cigarettes did you smoke today? So we call past month use recency of use. There are prospective studies, but many of them do not administer cannabis questionnaires from beginning to end. And as a result, there's really only a few where you can get a good amount of long-term data on cannabis use. And then finally, there's publication bias, which is something that we have experienced firsthand. Um, um, and that's kind of a spoiler alert, but many studies that report null findings in general, as you probably know, are not published or are less likely to be published. And that may be especially true when it comes to substance use, where the null findings don't support some prevailing cultural narrative. Here's an example of that. This study is a cross-sectional study. It was published in the Journal of the American Heart Association in fall of 2024. It uses 5 years of data from the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System. And that's a nationwide state-based survey funded by the CDC. And this study reported that cannabis use was associated with myocardial infarction, heart attack, and stroke. And it received a lot of attention from mainstream media. Earlier in the year, we also published a cross-sectional study using data from the NHANES, and the NHANES, excuse me, is the largest health survey in the US. It's designed to produce a nationally representative sample. It's also funded and managed by the CDC. And when we published this study in the American Journal of Cardiology, this is the attention that we got. High times on their Instagram account. And that's typically what you tend to see. If there's a finding of harm, then mainstream media outlets will pick it up. And if there's no finding of harm, then typically High Times and Normal and Americans for Safe Access will report on it. So just to come back to that first study for a second, if you look at the methods, the exposure was measured by this question, which you'll see over and over again. During the past 30 days, on how many days did you use marijuana or hashish? And this is that past month question that we call recent use. It can be binary, any value greater than 0 is past month use, or it can be continuous, number of days in the past month. The outcome was measured by this question. Has a doctor, nurse, or other health professional ever told you that you had any of the following: angina or coronary heart disease, myocardial infarction, or stroke? So unless these events occurred in the past month, it's really not possible that the exposure preceded the outcome in this study. And this is one of the key issues with cross-sectional studies is that the temporality can't be established typically between the exposure and the outcome. These investigators will argue that most of these recent users had a history of regular use, and that is true, but it's still a surrogate here. So our focus has been on regular use because that is what is likely to underlie a chronic disease process like hypertension or atherosclerosis. And it started with this publication that I just mentioned. And I'm going to very quickly talk about this publication. We used data from the NHANES, about a decade's worth of data up to 2018 from 2009. Those roughly 9,700 middle-aged adults. And our primary exposure variable was self-reported history of monthly cannabis smoking preceding an MI. And sometimes I will call this regular use. Sometimes I will call this a history of regular use. Technically, this is a history of regular cannabis smoking as defined by us. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. We also looked at the duration of that regular use as years as well as tertiles, and we looked at the recency of it. The outcome was self-reported history of physician diagnosed MI. This is yes, no, a binary variable. We looked at stratified analyses by sex, race, ethnicity, cigarette smoking status, and recency of use. And we used multivariable logistic regression. So I quickly want to show you the questions available for those years in NHANES so you can get a sense for what was available and some of the questionnaires that are used. This was a great data set, which is why we used it. There were 9 questions. Have you ever even once used marijuana or hashish? So this is the never ever question, and notice that the method of use is not specified. How old were you the first time you used it? This is often used as a stratification variable, which we also did. Again, the method of use is not specified. Have you ever smoked it at least once a month for more than a year? So this is our regular use variable, yes, no. How old were you when you started smoking it at least once a month for a year? How long has it been since you last smoked it at least once a month for a year? So if you use these questions, you could figure out when their regular use started, when it stopped, and then you have their age. And so you could figure out there was 10 years of it between the age of 20 and 30, let's say. And then we also have the age of their MI. So we were able to just isolate the portion of the exposure that occurred prior to their heart attack. During the time that you smoked it, how often would you usually use it? This is times per day. During the time that you smoked it, how many joints or pipes would you usually smoke in a day? How long has it been since you last used it? During the past 30 days, on how many days did you use it? And notice this is use, not smoked, but we assume mostly that most of the time it's smoking. We use those questions to create exposure categories. I'm just going to jump to the fully adjusted model and the results here. This is odds ratio. So the line of no difference is 1. All of these comparisons are to never use. This is the primary analysis here. So you can see that the odds ratio for regular use and non-regular use is less than 1 and not significant. The same is true for the duration of that regular use, greater than 0 to less than 5 years, 5 to 10 years, and 10 years. Again, these point estimates are less than 1 and not significant. And then recency of use, and then non-recent use here. So this finding was significant. The odds ratio is around 3. And we speculated that this might be similar to the smoker's paradox, which is a phenomenon sometimes described in tobacco literature to explain why former tobacco smokers may have worse outcomes or greater risk factors than current tobacco smokers. And the idea is that they stopped using tobacco because of some health-related condition that is associated with their greater risk. And perhaps the same is true for cannabis use. So we applied the same approach for blood pressure and hypertension in NHANES. And hypertension, as you know, is associated with tremendous morbidity and mortality in Western societies. It's both a cardiovascular disease and a risk factor for cardiovascular disease, depending on how you think about it. And the evidence base for the relationship between cannabis use and hypertension is both limited, particularly in terms of longitudinal study, and mixed with regard to the findings. This slide should look very similar. In terms of the exposure, the sample is slightly different, but in terms of the exposure, we were not able to isolate the exposure that occurred before the diagnosis of hypertension, unfortunately. Otherwise, we have the same exposure variables. We looked at systolic and diastolic blood pressure and prevalent hypertension. We used the 2017 American College of Cardiology and American Heart Association guidelines for defining hypertension: greater than or equal to 130 systolic, greater than or equal to 80 diastolic, or use of a hypertensive medication. We looked at the same stratified analyses. We used ANCOVA for the continuous blood pressure variables and logistic regression for the binary hypertension variable. I know this table is dense. I'm just going to highlight a couple of things here. So this is that group of never users. We have those with no history of regular use, and then we have those with a history of regular use, which comprise roughly 25% of the sample. And that group of regular users was just a little bit older on average, 48 versus 47 years. 61% reported male sex compared to 44. 75% reported their race ethnicity as non-Hispanic white compared to 52. And then overall, less education and lower income. So on average, probably what you might expect, middle-aged non-Hispanic white males with less education and lower income. 30% of the sample reported more than 2 days per week of alcohol use compared to 12. 41% reported current cigarette smoking compared to 11. Median tobacco pack years was 7.7 compared to 0, and more minutes of physical activity per week. So greater use of alcohol and tobacco, cigarettes, and more physical activity. And this is something you're going to see again and again in this presentation. BMI was roughly the same, around 28, which is the overweight category. Mean systolic blood pressure was a little bit higher, 123 compared to 121.4. Diastolic blood pressure was roughly the same, around 75. Prevalence of hypertension was higher, 51% compared to 47%. Keep in mind this group is 1 year older. Use of hypertensive medications, 35 compared to 40. So on average, mixed cardiometabolic risk factors. The differences are pretty small and mostly due to age and the proportion of males. I won't have a time to go through this today, but many of these risk factors are in favor of regular users and survive adjustment for age and sex in multiple samples, but I won't spend too much time on that. Here we're looking at age and sex adjusted prevalence over time. This is that group of never users. Here are those with no history of regular use, and here are the group with a history of regular use. None of these really change over time. The gray line is individuals reporting recent use, and it starts to increase around 2013, 2014. The pink line is recent use by those with a history of regular use. In both of these, the trend is significant and positive. Perhaps, Colorado was the first state in 2012 which enacted legislation to allow adults to use recreational cannabis. It really wasn't implemented until 2014 or so. I think in 2014, Alaska, Oregon, and Washington enabled legislation. So perhaps this has something to do with legal access. On the left here, we're looking at age and sex adjusted systolic and diastolic blood pressure. Both show a very small, significant increasing trend over time. And on the right here, we're looking at this across the three groups of the primary exposure variable, very little difference between these lines. And now we're looking at hypertension prevalence, roughly even over the course of that 10-year period. And maybe a little bit of a difference here in 2011, 2012, but not a lot of separation in these lines for the three levels of the primary exposure. So in addition to the unadjusted model, we looked at a sociodemographic model, a lifestyle and behavioral model, and a cardiometabolic model. In the interest of time, I won't go through each of these covariates. Here we're looking at a forest plot of mean differences from the adjusted model. So the line of no difference here is 0, and all of these comparisons here are to never use. This is the primary analysis. The systolic blood pressure is the dark blue triangle. Diastolic blood pressure is the light blue square. And so here, this would be interpreted as those reporting a history of regular cannabis use have an average systolic blood pressure of 1.89 millimeters mercury greater than those reporting never use on average. And this finding is not statistically significant, but it almost is. Whether this is clinically significant is another question. It probably depends on the context, but still a pretty small magnitude there. Similar picture for duration of use and for recency of use. So most or almost all of these mean differences are greater than 0, but not significant, and the magnitude is fairly modest. Here we're looking at hypertension. The line of no difference again is, or now is 1, as these are odds ratios. And you can see almost all of these estimates are less than 1, with the confidence intervals crossing 1. So this table here is looking at the 25% of the sample that reported a history of regular use. So these are our regular users. On average, they report starting their regular use, which is really regular cannabis smoking, just to remind you, at 19 years of age. They report a median of 9 days of use in the past month and a median of 14 years of regular use. And over 60% report more than 10 years of regular use. This is the subgroup of them that report non-recent use. So perhaps this 60+% of those people discontinued their use. Maybe they aged out, or maybe they just aren't using regularly anymore and they used greater than 1 month ago. But you can maybe think of this group as not having an active exposure. And then here are the recent users. There's about just less than 40% of them. And so perhaps we could think of this group as those having a history of regular use, but also continuing to use. And they report initiating their regular use a little bit older at 21.5 years. They report a median of 14 days in the past month. So like every other day, a median of 25 years, and over 85% of them report more than 10 years of regular use. So to look at this, we stratified by recent use. Again, here in the recent use subgroup, the odds ratios are both below 1 and not significant. And here in the non-recent group, there is one odds ratio greater than 1. And this perhaps is that same finding that we saw in the MI study. And then we also looked at daily use. There were around 641 daily users. So we bifurcated those with a history of regular use into non-daily and daily use. And daily use was associated with a 35% lower odds of hypertension, but again, not significant. And then finally, for tobacco cigarette smoking, the only point estimate here that's greater than 1 is in the subgroup of current users. And again, the difference here is pretty small, and the confidence intervals are fairly wide and not significant. So no associations were found for the primary or secondary analyses, no differences across age, sex, race, ethnicity, cigarette smoking, or recency of use. And this, in addition to the obvious limitations of this cross-sectional study, for whatever reason, the cannabis use questions in the NHANES questionnaire were no longer asked once individuals were older than 59 years of age, even though they still asked them about cocaine and heroin, and I don't know why that was. So this required us to limit our sample to middle-aged adults. And so to further investigate this, we examined a different sample. In this study, we used cross-sectional data from the MESA study to look at older adults. And to reiterate something that I mentioned earlier, MESA is one of the more popular, for lack of a better word, cardiovascular disease cohort studies. And there were 7 different visits over the time period, which is 25 years or something like that. And they only asked about cannabis use at exam 6. And subsequent to exam 6 was exam 7, and they discontinued the questionnaire for some reason. And as you'll see, there was at least one flaw in the questionnaire. The background has, I think, mostly been covered with the previous slides. So MESA enrolled a little less than 7,000 men and women between 45 and 84 years, free of cardiovascular disease in the early 2000s. And they balanced the cohort across 4 different racial and ethnic groups, and they enrolled participants from 6 different field centers across the US. And our sample was comprised of just over 3,200 individuals. These are older adults now with an average age of 74. Time period is 2016 to 2018. Pretty much the same exposure variables and the same outcome variables and the same stratified analyses. Really, the difference here is that the MESA paper and proposal committee wanted us to redo our logistic regression analysis and use relative risk regression to produce prevalence ratios. So now we're going to be looking at prevalence ratios. We used the questionnaires to derive the exposure categories. There were two groups in this analysis. So due to the structuring of the questionnaire, there was no group of never users. So just no history of regular use and a history of regular use, of which 7.4% of the sample reported. And obviously this is lower than the 25% we saw in the NHANES. Overall, this group of regular users was younger. It was mostly comprised of Black and white males, interestingly, with more education and greater household income. And also importantly, they were 8 years younger on average, which maybe will explain why some of their cardiometabolic risk factors are lower. Although, as I mentioned, some of these do survive adjustment for age and for sex. Greater use of alcohol and tobacco, cigarettes, more physical activity, roughly lower metabolic cardiometabolic risk factors, but this is partially due to the age. These three models are fairly similar. And then moving on to the results. So here we're looking at the fully adjusted model, adjusted mean systolic blood pressure in blue and diastolic blood pressure in green across these two groups in the primary analysis. So no difference in either systolic or diastolic blood pressure in the fully adjusted model. Now we're looking at the duration of that regular use in tertiles, greater than 0 to 5, greater than 5 to 10, and greater than 10. Again, no difference in adjusted blood pressure. We also looked at years of regular use as a continuous measure. You can see these lines are pretty flat and these beta coefficients are pretty small. These are millimeters mercury in terms of the units. We use decades on the x-axis. So each decade of regular cannabis smoking was associated with a 0.13 millimeter mercury higher systolic blood pressure, 0.08 millimeter mercury higher diastolic blood pressure on average. Again, not significant. So here we broke that group of regular users into non-recent use and recent use. And again, no difference in their mean adjusted blood pressure. Here we're looking at hypertension prevalence. Regular users have a lower prevalence, 71% compared to 76. This makes sense since they're 8 years younger. The unadjusted prevalence ratio is 0.94. Here we're looking at that 0.94 here with the confidence interval. This is the unadjusted model in the lighter gray color. The reference category here is no history of regular use. And then to the right here, we have the fully adjusted model. And I'm going to use this convention in a number of figures going forward. So the unadjusted estimate is on the left in a lighter color, and the fully adjusted estimate is on the right in a darker color so that we can see the degree to which confounding factors contributed. And here, obviously, the prevalence ratio is really right on that line of no difference, 1.0. Now we're looking at the duration of regular use. Here are those three tertiles. We don't really see an increase in the prevalence with increased use. So no dose response effect, so to speak. And it's lower than the non-regular use group, which we are attributing, frankly, to the age difference. And so here, looking at those three tertiles again, you can see that the point estimates here are really just right on the line and clearly not significant. And we also looked at this continuously, and each decade of regular cannabis smoking was associated with a 1.4% lower prevalence of hypertension. Again, not significant. And now we're looking at recent use. Prevalence of hypertension is lower, 67% compared to 73, yet the groups are roughly the same age. And here on the left, again, no history of regular use is the reference category. Non-recent use and recent use both right on that line. And here on the right, we're comparing recent use with non-recent use. So the reference category is non-recent use. And again, this point estimate is right there on the line. So in summary, in a racially and ethnically diverse cohort of older adults, we found no evidence of increased prevalence of hypertension or increased blood pressure due to regular cannabis smoking for all the variables that we analyzed, including the stratified analyses. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to quickly talk about this study. So we applied this same methodology to different outcomes in MESA. We looked at carotid artery calcification, the presence or absence of it, so binary outcome. And then we looked at the extent of the coronary or the carotid artery calcification in those with calcification. We looked at the volume of that calcification, the density of it, and then we calculated an Agatston score. All three of those were continuous measures. And then we looked at stroke, yes, no. Unfortunately, there weren't enough events for stroke to analyze or to have it be meaningful. So I'm just going to show the results here. Again, the reference group is no history of regular use. This is the left common carotid, point estimate of 1.05. The right common carotid, 1.21, which is the highest estimate we've seen so far. And then either carotid artery, 1.16. So a little bit greater in magnitude, but not significant and still pretty small, relatively speaking. And here, 732 of those of the sample had calcified plaque as evidenced by a cardiac CT. And here's just the volume, the adjusted mean volume. As you can see, there's no difference between regular users and non-regular users. Okay, so this is the last study we're going to cover. This study is currently or about to be under review by the paper proposal committee at CARDIA. CARDIA enrolled over 5,000 black and white men who were younger, 18 to 30 years, in the mid-80s. They balanced the cohort over the same factors. They enrolled from 4 different communities. There were 10 different visits over 35 years, 5 years between these visits after 10 years, and they followed up with annual telephone calls. Our sample was just over 4,300 at baseline with an average age of 25. Due to attrition, we ended up with less than 3,000 with an average age of 62. Our primary analysis used cannabis years, a continuous variable interpreted like cigarette pack years. We used incident hypertension as opposed to prevalent hypertension, and we used this very complex marginal structural model analysis with inverse probability weights to adjust for time-varying confounding, and we did this all in a Cox proportional hazards regression model. I'm looking at the time. I'm going to be very quick here. So basically, one cannabis year is associated with 365 days of use. This variable was derived from previous CARDIA investigators, so we used their methods. This question, the past month use question, was asked. Let's just say, for example, in the exam year at 25, how many days did you use it in the past month? If a participant said 5, then it was assumed that they used it at that monthly rate since the last time the question was asked, which was 5 years ago. So one of the limitations in this variable is that there was an assumption that the monthly usage pattern didn't change over a period of time. This is the sample at exam year 35, going from none to more than 5 years of cannabis use or cannabis years, mostly comprised of black and white males with lower educational attainment. And as you might expect, greater use of alcohol and tobacco, cigarettes, greater physical activity, lower BMI with increasing cannabis years, higher prevalence of hypertension, and slightly higher systolic and diastolic blood pressure. Here we're looking at the exposure over time. Median cannabis years is 0 at baseline, increasing to 0.2 at exam year 35. As you might expect, the prevalence of hypertension increased to up to 70% at exam year 35. This is almost the final slide here. Incidence was 28 cases per 1,000 person years. Here are the 4 different models, and this is depicted graphically here. So this is now a hazard ratio. We looked at an odds ratio. We looked at a prevalence ratio. Here's a hazard ratio now, very close to the line of no difference with a non-significant confidence interval. And so effectively, we found no increased risk as associated with cannabis years. And just moving to the last slide here. So over all of these studies using different cohorts, different methods, slightly different variables and different analyses, we didn't find any risk or prevalence of hypertension among these groups. Several cardiometabolic risk factors were actually lower in cannabis users, and many of them regular cannabis users. Many of them survive adjustment for sex and age. And it's possible that an explanation for this includes the downregulation of CB1 receptors with repeated use and the upregulation of protective CB2 receptors in the presence of inflammation. And maybe the deleterious effects of CB1 are somehow offset by activation of CB2, or perhaps it has something to do with the increased physical activity, or both. So with that, I thank you for your time and your attention. I apologize for talking so quickly.